Welcome to the Who's Left podcast, a show about Indiana politics, history, and culture from an unapologetically leftist perspective. My name is Scott Aaron Rogers. I'm recording from Bloomington, and you've heard of Elf on a Shelf, but have you ever heard of Hornedo in a tornado? I spoke with my guest this past Friday night just before a line of intense storms hit the area, a tornado touching down less than a mile from my house and causing a great deal of property damage. Thankfully, we were unaffected. My neighbors who did take on damage were not hurt, and Indiana largely avoided casualties during this severe weather outbreak. Our hearts go out to those in Missouri and Kentucky who've lost lives and livelihoods, and I will be keeping an eye on the state and federal response. Now, my guest this week is mounting a primary challenge against incumbent 9-term Democratic Congressman Andre Carson, who has represented Indiana's 7th district since 2008. George Hornedo grew up and still lives on Indy's north side and has worked at the highest levels of state and national Democratic politics, including serving in the U.S. Department of Justice. Hornedo also worked for the Obama Foundation, leading mayoral outreach for the Reimagining Policing Pledge. He's secured hundreds of millions of dollars for infrastructure, water systems, and economic development projects in cities across the country, and led federal government outreach for Climate Ready Tech Hub, a consortium of local governments, businesses, universities, and development organizations working to implement groundbreaking solutions for climate resilience and sustainability. In this conversation, we'll talk about George's background and experience, his governing philosophy, and his priorities should he win this seat. We'll also look at Congressman Carson's record, the utility of labels like moderate or progressive, and I'll ask if Hornedo is another in a long line of candidates sponsored by the ultra-Zionist lobby to take on incumbents who support Palestinian rights. Now, first, this is where I ask you to please consider supporting Who's Left with a paid subscription. This is an independent media project. I don't paywall content, and I don't rely on advertising. Only individuals like you keep this thing going. So please, if you find value in this work, go to whosleft.us and subscribe at the paid level. It's only $5 a month or $50 a year to help me write more, research more, and organize more. I haven't raised my prices with inflation. Still, not ready for a long-term commitment? You can make a one-time contribution on Cash App or Venmo. Links are in the show notes. Me and my old body would like to spend less time on construction and more time constructing a better future for Indiana, but I need your financial support to do so. You can also help by liking and sharing on social media, commenting, leaving reviews, providing feedback, and forwarding articles to your people. We are building a community of Hoosiers dedicated to making the state and its government work for all of us, not just the elite few. Follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok at Who's Left, and I'm personally at ScottRog78 on Instagram, Threads, Twitter, and Mastodon. Tell the others. Let's build a radically democratic Indiana together. Thanks again. Now, here is my interview with George Hornedo. George Hornedo, welcome to the Who's Left podcast.
No, thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
Really appreciate you being with us. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody? Tell us a little about yourself. Where are you from? Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? And what do you do? What are you up to these days besides your campaign?
Oh, not too much. It's not really been busy at all. But no, my name is George Hornedo. Grew up here in Indianapolis. Went to Park Tudor School. Went to Cornell for undergrad, Harvard for my master's in education policy, George Washington University for my law degree. Have always kind of worked in and around democratic policy and politics. I came into loving policy because, quite frankly, my own life. My parents were high school sweethearts. Married young, had me young. So in those early years, We struggled early on. I don't want to
Yeah.
overemphasize it or anything. I had a wonderful childhood, but even being able to benefit from programs like WIC, for short periods as a child,
Yeah.
I think about things like that and the positive impact that government can have on people's lives. And kind of growing up, always being taught about the importance of public service and lifting while you climb and giving back, and seeing a lot of the sacrifice that my family made, so that I could have the best education possible that would open up, kind of a world of opportunities. And, you know, I've been able to really achieve my own American dream, but can't discount the fact that it's, increasingly out of reach for more and more people.
Yeah.
And so, that has always been kind of a North Star and a driving force as to the policy side of things. And then, I love politics, the other side of the coin, I guess, because I see it as sport with consequence. As a 5'7.5" man, and I give myself that half. Was never going to play, college or professional sports, and so to me, politics is my sport. And I may not always agree with my team, but it's two teams at the end of the day, red versus blue, or at least how things are structured currently, and it's about values at the end of the day, and how we work together to push towards those shared values and materially improve and impact people's lives for the good. And I love the Colts. I love the Pacers. I'm deeply excited for the Eastern Conference Finals, and the fact that Game 3 is going to be right after the Indy 500. That is surely going to be a day. But whoever wins, these games, doesn't necessarily affect my life 20 years down the road, but
Right.
who we elect to public office, does. And so, I've always been, from a career standpoint, working in and around politics. So I joke that, during my undergrad and my master's degree, I was a perennial Obama world intern. So everything from the Obama White
Yeah.
House, doing intergovernmental affairs, to Obama reelect headquarters in Chicago in 2012, to the Presidential Inaugural Committee in 2013. Had done the Center for American Progress anti-poverty policy team. Had done some work around early childhood development. The DNC, etc. And when I was, wrapping up for my master's, I reached out to, kind of all the mentors that I'd worked, for to that point, and they really went to bat for me. And it really does kind of take a village. And I was fortunate enough to land a political appointment in the Obama administration at the Department of Justice, first under Attorney General Holder, where I was doing, communications for the Civil Rights Division, and that was mere
Oh,
weeks before Ferguson, mere weeks before Eric Garner in New York. And so
yeah.
it's quite the time to have that sort of portfolio, and, got promoted under Attorney General Lynch, and, did everything from, civil rights to civil, antitrust to national security. And, from there knew that I was going to go to law school, but had an opportunity on Clinton campaign headquarters in Brooklyn come up. So went on there on the delegate operation that wrapped up at convention, came back, started school, had every intention to do it 110%. But then quickly got pulled into the Clinton Kane pre-elect transition team, where I was
Mm-hmm.
essentially working full time there. Not really as my classmates would remember doing the reading, so I'd be saying pass during cold calls. Uh,
Uh-huh.
and then once we lost, kind of reeling from that, and wanting to find ways to still be in the fight and add value. Helped run a successful DNC vice chair race. Then eventually ran the policy shop for a national voting rights organization for a couple years. And as I was wrapping up school in 2019, I'd been in conversations with a couple different campaigns, presidential campaigns, but I've known Mayor Pete since 2012. And so once his
Mm.
quarter one fundraising numbers came out, and showed that he was a real enough candidate and wasn't going to be dropping out in a couple weeks or anything, I said, this wouldn't be a terrible professional or financial decision to try and join. So I reached out to him and I said, I graduate soon, put me to work. Next thing I know, day after law school graduation, started as his national delegate director. Eventually, moved up to deputy political for delegates and for marathon states. Had a great experience there, and after the primary, I ended up finally getting the chance to study for and pass the Indiana bar exam. Before then, working for the Obama Foundation, leading mayoral outreach and engagement on their reimagining policing pledge in the wake of George Floyd's.
Mm.
So got over 300 mayors across the country to sign on to a pledge reviewing their use of force policies. ended up moving to do voter protection for the Biden campaign, for the coordinated campaign, during the general. Moved back to DC, with the anticipation of joining the administration until an unexpected opportunity, came up to join the DC office of a law firm headquartered here in Indianapolis. And I talked to various political mentors. They said, right opportunity, right time, get a little bit of a different texture to your experience. You're young, you can always go back into government and politics. And so I ended up going to that firm and represented the African American Mayors Association, the cities of Birmingham, Jackson, Little Rock, a couple national nonprofits. So really enjoyed the ability to help bring federal funds to communities across the country on all sorts of
Yeah.
issues. And then eventually, almost 2 years ago now, hung my own shingle so I could do the same sort of work, but also so I had have the ability to pursue other passions that didn't quite fit within the economic model of a law firm and the
Yeah.
billable hour. And so ended up starting an organization called Next Gen Hoosiers, thinking the ripples of hope that I see here in our devolving political climate, unfortunately, are not necessarily just in younger voices, but in newer leaders more generally. So how do I
Mhm.
use my background, my platform, my network to kind of be working the phones, doing call time, and trying to shake trees of donors both locally and nationally, and say, don't forget about us, Hoosier Dems. And so that was a wonderful experience, and kind of along the way, got encouragement to start looking at this race. And next thing we know, here I am. And so that's a lot more that I threw at you than you probably expected, but gives a little bit of
No, that's great. It sounds like, you've been doing a lot of work, sort of behind the scenes, doing a lot of campaign work, volunteer stuff, working in the DOJ, lots of jumping around. That's
been fun.
I imagine it takes a certain skill set just to be able to like hop in and like learn and process all this new stuff, and while you're um really doing while you're learning.
I mean, absolutely, and it's kind of how I think and approach everything, right? And part of how I'm thinking about what we need in this role, you know, uh, it's all kind of data collection, right? It's like understanding what
Mhm.
people are doing, like what issues they care about, what they're working on at a current moment, like what they think is going well, what they think can be improved, connecting dots on policy, connecting dots on people that can collaborate together. So always trying to be thoughtful and intentional about how can I bring people together and really engage, but you can't do that if you don't know what's going on, right? And so
Yeah.
I think the same as it comes to this race for Congress, that I launched last month here in the 7th district, which, yes, technically is a primary challenge against Andre Carson, but that's not how I think about it. I think about it as a race for the future of Indianapolis. And so when I think about this, I think about how I think the role needs to be more than what it technically is, which is
Mm.
the 7th district's representative in DC. I think it also needs to be a party builder. I think it also needs to be that convener, that collaborator. And I guess, Scott, unless you want to take this other places, please, let me know. But maybe I can parlay this a little bit into kind of the three buckets of why I'm animated in this race, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, like this is a can of worms I was going to open up anyway. We're going to get into this. So,
Yeah,
but but before we do that, this is your first time being the candidate yourself, yeah.
correct.
So why Congress? Why this race first? Why not, wet your beak on a little like a city council race or a state house race or something along those lines? It's like going from single A right to the majors.
I mean, because I can do the job not only for what the baseline of the job is, but what we need to make the job. So, I'm animated for three different reasons. Bucket one is representation. And look, I respect Congressman Carson up until this. I had a good relationship with Congressman Carson, but sometimes we need to tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. And the truth is, unfortunately, that he is consistently ranked by the Center for Effective Lawmaking is one of the least effective members of Congress across both parties in both the House and the Senate. The latest report, has him, 197th out of 220 Democrats. So that's bottom 9%. Out of all members, he's bottom 6.5%, or
Mm,
something to that nature. And this is using an objective methodology that looks at everything from, federal dollars brought home, number of bills as lead sponsor, as a co-sponsor, amendments, levels of success, even looking at constituent services. So whichever way you slice or dice things, we're not getting the representation that we deserve. We're behind peer cities, urban cities in the Midwest, and we deserve better. And look, this is not just about diagnosing a problem. This is about being able to solve it as well. And so, in the 3.5 years that I've been doing, work on the government affairs side, I've helped bring, nearly $800 million in federal funding to communities across the country. And if that's what I can do from the outside, imagine what I can do, as an actual member of Congress with real, authority and real influence. So that's bucket number one.
Yeah.
Two, I don't think we ever could have afforded that, but we certainly can't afford it now. And I think whoever sits in this seat needs to also take on the additional leadership role of party builder. Because back when Democrats in Indiana were competing and even winning statewide, it's in large part because Indianapolis was organized.
Yeah.
Our county party budget was larger than the state Democratic Party budget. Our precinct chair and vice chair slots were filled. That's the baseline of organizing in neighborhoods. We were the strongest or one of the strongest congressional districts in the state in voter turnout. Now, under 17 years of Congressman Carson's tenure, without taking on that party building leadership role, the political infrastructure is hollowed out. So we are now the worst congressional district in the state in voter turnout. 36% of our precinct chair and vice chair slots are unfilled. Most of those that are filled are appointed. So not necessarily to folks that have the grassroots energy and engagement in their areas, but are simply party insiders. And then also, the county party has a budget that is a fraction of what it used to be. And the thing that I think a lot about is that, yes, we're gerrymandered to hell, so we're not going to win any more congressional districts
Right.
anytime soon. We have to first try and break through the Republican super majorities, and we've got 4 House seats to be able to do that in the Indiana House. So we're not going to have majorities anytime soon like we used to.
Right.
But we can compete statewide again. You know,
Mhm. Mhm.
I think about places like Kansas and Kentucky that are not Democratic states, but they've got Democratic governors. And granted, it's a
Yeah.
little bit different in Kentucky with the Bashir name and legacy, but metro areas in these states, voter turnout is in the mid to high 60s. Here in Indianapolis, we're in the low to mid 50s. That is not an insurmountable gap. You know, yes, it means that we need a strong Democratic candidate up against a weak, Republican candidate, but that's how we were winning before. Joe Donnelly versus, Richard Murdoch is an example, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So we can get there. I truly do believe that, but it's going to require vision. And I understand that vision building is not easy, but unless you have a vision, you know, then you're just walking aimlessly. And then having a vision is simply not enough. You need the ability to execute upon that vision. You need the ability to rally people around that vision. But for too long here in Indianapolis, for too long in Democratic leadership in the state, for too long nationally, quite frankly, we have not had that sort of vision. And we're seeing the detrimental
Mhm.
results
Mhm.
of that. And then bucket number 3 is larger than district representation, larger than party building and power building here in the state. And I think about it as this moment in time as a country, as a Democratic Party at large, kind of lost in the wilderness trying to find our way. And people often talk about the split in the party being between left versus center, progressive versus moderate, and now we're hearing a lot more about young versus old.
Mhm.
I actually don't think that that's the case right now. You, to the extent that that was informative before, I don't think it quite describes the moment that we're in now. I think that if anything, that there's subsets of something much more fundamental. And I think that fundamental split and that deeper divide is between those like Congressman Carson who believe that our systems and our institutions largely work for people and that we simply need to protect them right now and manage this period of decline versus those like myself in my generation and younger generations that grew up in crisis, or even those that didn't grow up in crisis, but that certainly acknowledge, yes, of course we have to do what we can to protect what we have right now. But we also have to acknowledge we also have to acknowledge that Trump is actively dismantling government day in and day out. And so
Yes.
whenever Democrats come back into power, we are not walking back into a government that at all resembles what we knew. And so this chaos is going to bring about an opportunity to rebuild. And so the question then becomes, do we rebuild back to what we knew, which clearly was not sufficiently meeting and serving the needs of people? Or are we going to have the imagination to think about what it can be? And so I
Yeah.
just don't think that the leaders that got us into this mess are the ones to get us out of it. And then the other thing I think about is, look, I don't care what party one is from. Everybody feels like government is not working and they're right to feel that way. What we're seeing right now is a hammer taken where a scalpel is required. We're seeing a focus on tearing things down as opposed to building something that does work. But we also have to hold the mirror up to ourselves as Democrats because I can't tell you what the governing philosophy of the Democratic Party is. I can't tell you what the plan is. So then that forces me to then think, all right, what's my governing philosophy? Like, how do I think about things? And I think of that philosophy as radical proportionality, which may sound scary, but in a sentence, it's how do we align the scale of our solutions with the scale of our challenges?
Yeah.
And so to give a concrete example, affordable housing. It's
Mhm.
a crisis
Mhm.
here in India, a crisis across the country. When we're talking about tax credits, when we're talking about building a couple thousand affordable housing units, it's something, but it's a flea on an elephant. Versus
Yeah.
if we looked at housing as infrastructure, would
Mhm.
that simple reframe allow us to unlock massive amounts of public dollars to address the issue in whatever fashion, but to do so at scale, right? And so whenever I give that example, sometimes people say, wow, that's rather progressive. And I think the issue is that people associate throwing money at a problem as progressive and then the opposite as moderation, right? And I think that this whole left right construct generally in our politics or left
Yeah.
center within the party is more divisive than it is informative. I think most of us are much more complex than what any one label can denote.
Sure.
And to give an example, for me, right? Some people can look at me and say, politically young, Hispanic, kind of the personal background I laid out, you know, working on issues like civil rights, criminal justice reform, community policing, environmental justice, and then the ability to even take on a race like this and kind of the bold truth telling side of that and say progressive. Other people can look at me and say, okay, Cornell, Harvard, lawyer, worked at a law firm, worked for establishment, quote unquote
Yeah. Yeah.
officials, have my own consultancy, and I can do the buttoned up professional thing. And they can say establishment moderate. Thing is, all of those things are true at the same time. And so obviously to run, for Congress or run for any office is to put oneself out there in a pretty public way, certainly
Yeah.
more public
Yeah.
than I've been before. And so politics is a realm that I've too often seen people lose themselves. And so wanting that not to be the case here really put a lot of like thought and pen to paper on who am I? Like, what are my values? Like, what am I hoping to accomplish here? What is my approach to politics? What is, my vision and agenda, and what am I looking to do? And in an approach to politics standpoint, I've got these big, bold ideals and visions, which some could reductively call progressive, but you have to pair it with practical action at the end of the day, which some may
Mhm.
reductively call
Mhm.
moderate, right? But that's actually not to be confused with incrementalism, because I think one of the things we need to be better at as a party is that when we have all the levers on our side and have that ability to push for transformative change, we need to move hard and move fast and get that transformative
Mhm.
change. But when the political windows and opportunity structure does not allow for that, how are we still working and moving to be able to positively and materially affect, and improve people's lives? Because this is what it has to be about at the end of the day, not just talk, not just having a bully pulpit. And so at first I refer to that as, progressive pragmatism, which is not unique. But then I thought, you know what? We've got a hell of a problem with language in the Democratic Party. And
Yeah.
I've got no issue with the word progressive, but some people do. I've got no issue with the word pragmatism, but some people do. And so instead, I call it, the winning approach, because I don't care what faction of a party one is from. I don't care what party one is from. We all want to win at the end of the day, and you can't govern unless you win. Because, like I said, politics is, a sport, and it is a sport that's all about coalition building, addition, not subtraction. And so, how do we make sure that we're talking about things that still push forward our values and what we're trying to accomplish, but in ways that can bring, others into the fold? So, and
No, you're right. Yeah.
I was just going to say,
Talking about Yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
I was just going to say, to kind of tie it back, like I'd love to see the new construct not be left versus right or left versus center. I'd love to see it up versus down. The solution is up to the left, up to the center, up to the right, should matter less than if we're moving up, right? Are we actually, you know, helping people? Like it should be about accountability and results at the end of the day. I think when Republicans are in office, we're too often moving back, we're moving down. When
Yeah.
Democrats are in office, sometimes we're moving up, sometimes we're moving forward, but too often we're caught complacent, we're caught stagnant because we're doing the left versus center, progressive versus moderate battle and fight. And I just think it misses the moment in time that we're in right now.
The words, just the left and right and
Mhm,
progressive and center and conservative, that they assume kind of this single straight line,
mhm,
like the x-axis, but we're also working on a y-axis too. So yeah, we might you might be more or less progressive or conservative on economic issues, and
mhm,
your social issues maybe don't match that. I mean, you see right now in the Senate,
mhm.
Josh Hawley out of Missouri, arch like MAGA
Yep.
far right guy, is like, "Hey, Trump, do just like, hey Trump, hey Doge, stay
Mhm,
away from Medicaid. Don't cut Medicaid." They're okay with redistributive economic policies,
mhm,
but only for their very narrow
mhm.
white Christian conservative
Yeah.
uh, constituents. Whereas on the Democratic side, I think we are really relatively largely all on board as social progressives, and the issues we wind up fighting over are economic, and really we're fighting over how much capitalism
Mhm,
is appropriate to have in our system, and some folks, what we would call establishment or centrist Democrats, are like, yeah, no, capitalism, great, it's good. Maybe we can rein it in a little bit here and there, but overall, the market is really good at, you know, giving us the outcomes we want to see.
mhm,
And I think, leftists or progressives are like, no, the market is out of hand and needs more regulation, and
mhm,
the government should do more.
mhm,
And these, the up and down and the left and right,
mhm.
they get conflated
Yep.
into this one axis that just really um, eliminates a lot of the nuance.
Yeah, I mean,
That
and look, most of life is in the gray, right? And so to
Right.
treat everything in politics as if it's black or white, isn't necessarily fair, and it's not what people are experiencing. And so I totally understand how people only have so much capacity to take in messages amongst their very busy lives, professionally, personally, and then whatever of politics seeps in, and so trying to be disciplined and have a message, and sometimes it gets very simplified and flattened, right? So I get
Yeah.
that, but we also need to do a better job at seeing the humanity in each other, and really being able to sit across a table from one another, or across a laptop from another one another, and
Right.
and really just get to know each other, and understand where people are coming from, what their lived experiences are.
So we're talking about Representative Carson and sort of why you're challenging him. Um, Say that Indianapolis deserves like a more present leadership, more engaged, more bringing the bacon home to Indianapolis more uh, than he is. Because I was going to ask, you mentioned this organization that uses these metrics to determine that Carson is one of the least effective members. And I was going to ask, well, is that based on dollars or voting record or fundraising or what have you? But it sounds like, yeah, maybe a bit of all of those things. He's not. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, the fundraising piece I didn't touch on. I mean, to give an example, I mean, he hasn't really had to fundraise. This is a safe seat, and he's never had a credible primary challenge.
Yeah.
But he raises about $800,000, per 2 year cycle. Typically the majority of that is PAC money, much of that corporate PAC money. I do not take corporate PAC money. Um, that is less than half of the average member of Congress. So I think about the fact of, okay, the complacency that unfortunately we see on the representation side, that same complacency is on the power building, party building, and fundraising
Yeah.
side. And if he even raised, what the average member of Congress does, knowing that he has a safe seat, is that money that could be used to help his colleagues nationally that are in more competitive races?
Yeah.
And does that make him a more important player in DC? And does that have downstream benefit of bringing more dollars home? Or rather, does that help kind of redistribute some of that money towards the party building sort of work that we need to be doing here? Because if nobody's really stepping up to do it, then we're going to end up with Governor Beckwith in 8 years. And
Oh
that's
my god, that's
terrifying, right? And so to have power and not wield it is a waste. And to have a safe seat, you have to really be passing the performance test. But the thing is, like, I do not think about this race is about any one person. It's not about me. It's not about Congressman Carson. I don't even think about this race honestly as one race or one cycle. It's about what are we building for the future, and I want this to outlive whatever happens, win or lose in this race.
sure.
And look, I worked obviously, a lot of campaigns, in my career, and I've seen and been up close to a lot of campaigns here locally over the years. And the fact that this early on, I already have almost 100 volunteers through the funnel, folks within district, within central Indiana or elsewhere within Indiana, and then even folks outside of the state that are taking to our message and wanting to add value in any way, shape, or form. And these are folks that are learning to, do digital organizing, folks that will be learning to kind of do all the on the ground organizing,
Yep.
peer to peer fundraising. And I think about this as, these are people that can be volunteers for campaigns going forward. These are folks that maybe will run for party leadership positions in the future. They may even be candidates themselves, and so all of this is important to give people a choice, right? I was quoted, in Axios today after a recent interview was saying that our win is inevitable. But it's not that I'm inevitable. It's that change is inevitable. And people
Yeah.
in Indianapolis on the ground are yearning for more. They're yearning for better. And we simply deserve that. We deserve somebody that wants to do the job and is going to be effective. We deserve somebody that wants to take on that party building leadership role. We deserve somebody that isn't just trying to manage the decline, but is thinking about what it looks like to outbuild it. That's what we need right now. And that's what I'm aiming to bring to the people of the seventh district.
It's one of the more pernicious effects, I think, of gerrymandering. Like, obviously, the districts across the state are rigged and drawn so that Republicans have, 7 safe seats, and, they grant Democrats those 2 safe seats,
Mhm.
and it leaves us in a position where, okay, like, yeah, we get that seat, but then
Yeah.
you get lazy and
Mhm.
fat and happy, and you don't have to work for the seat because you're sort of guaranteed it, and you're comfortable with, oh, hey, well, we're in a minority position, that's what it is, but I'm comfortable.
Yeah.
um and as Andre Carson is Indiana's probably most prominent elected Democrat,
Yes.
right? I mean, we don't have a Democratic governor or senators, no one at the state level.
Mhm.
So it kind of comes down to Carson he's been there
Mhm.
for a while.
Mhm.
So with that, as the most prominent elected Democrat in Indiana, it's sort of incumbent upon him to be the face of the party, raise for others, show up, help lift the next generation around. If you look up at in Wisconsin, for
Mhm.
example, Mark Pocan.
Yep.
great rep,
Absolutely.
progressive guy, blah
Mhm.
blah blah. He's hosting town halls in neighboring Republican
Yes.
districts
Yeah.
to talk about the things that maybe they're not hearing from their reps because their reps are too cowardly to face a town hall.
Yeah.
And so it'd maybe be nice to see him doing something like that.
I know. Yeah. I mean, look, there's not much of anything that I agree with Representative Sparks on, but even she had an in-person town hall,
Yes.
and
Yes.
unfortunately, we've had two virtual town halls with Congressman Carson, and most recently, he held a community conversation with
Hmm.
House Minority Whip Catherine Clark, and apparently at that community conversation, he had reference to folks that he hasn't held an in-person town hall because of death threats, which of course we have to take seriously, and that's terrible for him to even have to endure that or have
Yeah.
any sort of anxiety or fear around that. But it does also beg the question on, does the community loses access as a result, right? And so
Hmm.
it's tough. These are tough things, to be at the loss from a community perspective of not being able to have that real access, and for it to be
Yeah.
a ticketed RSVP only event where the questions are pre-screened. The event starts late but ends on time. Only 6 questions are asked. It's just not the ideal, and I think people want the ability to kind of press the flesh, and be able to ask whatever is on their mind. And so, I'm out here running a grassroots, people powered, community centered, campaign. And look, I'm certainly going to the rooms with Democratic Party activists, people that I've long known and worked with. But I also understand that that is a small body at the end of the day, a body that
But even then, that body has still got a lot of diversity within it, a lot of
Mhm.
diversity within opinion. It is
Yeah, yeah.
certainly not a bunch of nodding heads.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I am learning that. I guess I'll put it this way. I would say there are about 2 to 300 folks whose political lives are their personal lives, where they believe they represent community, and to some extent, certainly, but it's
Hmm.
often a lot of representing each other. And I don't even say that in a disparaging manner by any means. These are folks, like I mentioned, that I very much know and like. But if we're generous and say that on average they bring 10 voters with them, we're talking 2 to 3 thousand votes. That is not something that universally would be with the congressman when all said and done. But I'm actually very surprised to find out at this very early stage that I have more support, to your point, of diverse opinions within this kind of universe of voters than I would have anticipated. But I'm also trying to be everywhere else. Out here meeting with, you know, labor leaders, people involved in their faith communities, neighborhood associations, nonprofit and philanthropic leaders, just really kind of meeting people where they're at, hearing their issues. And these are the sorts of folks that aren't hearing from their congressman, that aren't,
Yeah.
getting outreach in those meetings, that haven't heard from, their council member or their state reps or their mayors and are just kind of left behind. But these are folks that are voters. These are folks that have a stake in the future of the city, that are doing work in and of their own right to push it forward. And so that kind of goes back to what I was mentioning earlier, where look, there's so much grit and creativity and strength, people doing important and impactful things here in Indianapolis. But what I'm not always seeing is the connectivity between it all. So, in the same way that I say that whoever is in this congressional seat not only needs to do the baseline, have a vision for the community and the work ethic to execute upon it, but to also take on that additional leadership role of party builder. I think even further, there is the additional leadership role of being that convener, being that connector, that collaborator. But you can't do that unless you grasp your arms around all the rich assets and the people, our biggest asset that we have in this community. And then, on top of that, yes, we have our state house and we have our state senate leadership, and we have our mayors and this and that. But again, as you said it, Congressman Carson is, the most prominent, Democrat here in the state. Whoever is the most prominent Democrat here in the state should also be speaking about state issues that are happening, that should be
Yeah.
speaking out against Republican issues, and leadership and detrimental effects it shouldn't just be about Capitol Hill. Obviously, that's baseline, but this role can be so much more.
Yeah, yeah, it really can. Well, I mean, you look at somebody like AOC. You
Mhm,
know, she is a congressperson representing a district in a large city.
mhm,
She's out there touring the whole country,
mhm.
building the party, drumming up excitement, talking about our values,
Yep.
and yeah, you'd really like to see a little more of that around Indiana because we don't have a deep bench, and so
Mhm,
you need the people that are already in there to use what power they
mhm.
have to lift people
Yeah.
up. Um, so we've been talking about Representative Carson, maybe as a party builder or a leader, maybe leave something to be desired there. What about his voting record? Like, do you have any beef with his actual voting record in Congress?
Largely no. I mean, again, he's a safe Democratic vote, but it's not, being a safe Democratic vote. We need somebody to really take on the role and really be active, and proactive, and not
Yeah.
just. I'm not trying to be mean when I say, but not just be a warm body, quite frankly, because that's what we have right now, and we just deserve better.
And a lot of the warm bodies that we're talking about. The party has a gerontocracy problem. We've got folks in their late 70s and 80s
Mhm,
still in Congress.
mhm.
Like, all right, maybe it's time for the rocking chair and spend time with the grandkids and let somebody else take over. That's not Carson's issue. He's only in his 50s.
Yeah.
Like he should have the energy to be out there doing some of this.
And that's why you don't see me making this about age. Sure, I talk about next generation results oriented politics, and certainly I am younger, but Congressman Carson's only 50, but he's also been there for 17 years and may have an older mindset with respect to how we do this work.
Mm,
But
mhm,
I'm
mhm.
less concerned about any member of Congress's age so much as I am about their results. You could be older, but be getting results, keep on keeping on, keeping that seat and do the work, right? You could be a younger member, but not really be getting results. So maybe we need something different, right? So a lot of these aspects, left, center, old, young, these are not the metrics that I personally am evaluating people by. I'm evaluating people by how present they are, how visible they are, how ingrained they are in their communities, their actual results on Capitol Hill, but then also how they're thinking outside of the box beyond, just the role. Because look, we also have to acknowledge that there's only so much, that a singular member of Congress can do.
Right.
But there are other ways, like we've discussed, to use that role, to use that platform for good. And those are, aspects in which I judge folks as well.
One thing I do really worry about, and we've sort of seen this trend over the last couple election cycles. Um, Say what you will about the rest of Andre Carson's career, he has been one of the few vocal Democrats in Congress over the last couple of years, especially in the second Trump administration, calling out the overreach of the government. Um, they're kidnapping and disappearing
Mhm.
students who have ever said a negative word about Israel and their policies, on their college campus.
Well,
Um,
that's a completely slippery slope. We can't
yeah,
you don't
and
you don't have to agree with folks on any given issue to recognize that that is wrong. There is no justification for that. And, regardless of somebody's, views and perspective on, everything going on in the Middle East,
yeah,
we all have to be able to stand up to this authoritarian, you know, uh, you know line that we're walking down, because if it
yeah.
happens to one person one day, who's to say it doesn't happen to me, next week? Who's to say it doesn't happen to you next month, right? So, this is something where we need to lock arms and just call this out for what it is.
I worry that if you look at Cory Bush last year, um, Democrat out of St. Louis, got primaried by a guy who was supported by a lot of APAC money. The same thing happened in New York to Jamal Bowman. They tried to get Summer Lee in Pennsylvania, but she escaped. Um, I worry that there are certain powerful elements who do not respect Representative Carson's vociferous support for the Palestinian people. Um, are any of those organizations like APAC supporting you?
So this is something that there is a lot of rumor. I'm finding out so much about myself in this race that I never knew until I
Mm-hmm.
got into the race, and so there's a lot of bad faith going on. You know, to kind of answer, around everything, and just to kind of lay out my view on the issues. So, one, I got into this race, no guarantees, no organizations, no individuals, etc. Like I said, this is a people-powered grassroots campaign that we're building from the bottom up. Two, like we mentioned, earlier, a lot of politics things are unfortunately just brought into binaries, right?
Mm-hmm.
When the world is much
Right.
more gray, and so in this instance, the binary is pro-Israel versus pro-Palestine. That's not necessarily how I view things. In terms of my actual view, I think about I think about it this way. There's this African proverb that I like, and that it's when the elephants fight, it's the grass that truly suffers. So I think what we
Mm-hmm.
see happening right now is a battle of leadership that is at the detriment of both the Israeli people and the Palestinian people, and we have to recognize that. I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu is the worst possible leader at the worst possible time. But I also think that Hamas is a terrorist agency that is in the way of the agency of both the Israeli and the Palestinian people. And I think that is also objectively true. I obviously understand that Israel is a you know a strong economic and militaristic power, but I also
Mm-hmm.
think that it misses the mark when people speak about it as if it's the big bad wolf. Because anybody can look at a map and see it's this tiny landmass surrounded by antagonistic actors towards it, and then also taking into account history, right? So of course this is existential. You know what's happening right now is obviously nobody wants this. This is war is terrible. The atrocities are terrible, and we have to be able to call out our allies, when we need to, but still
Mm-hmm.
understand that they are our allies and that we stand by them, and that Israel has a right to defend itself, and we as America have a right to also be able to share our voice, on such issues, and be able to push them in appropriate directions and make sure that humanitarian aid is getting to where it needs to. So that's something that I think it's a both and. I'm pro-human at the end of the day. That's how I think about
Right.
it. But I give that view, and people will reductively say, oh, okay, he's not on pro-Palestine side, and I just don't think that that's the framework by which we need to view things. So that's my more nuanced view of the situation. But we have to. I mean, there's also a democratic nation as well, and so we
Yeah.
have to really understand and respect that and take all the context.
You said that you reject corporate money.
Yes,
You won't take any corporate PAC money.
yes.
Would you take foreign government PAC money?
If the implication is that AIPAC is foreign government backed money, that's not how I view that. That's issue based advocacy, and the only line that I draw is corporate PAC money because there's a profit
Mm,
motive. Anything issue based advocacy, that's something that's
yeah.
a different manner. But as a general,
Well, I ask about them specifically because I mean there are multiple like lobbying groups who are pro-Israel
Mhm,
in their stance, but APAC in particular, number one, they are very well funded, particularly like by the Adelson family, and they are they are a far right Israeli lobbying organization as opposed to like say J Street,
mhm.
which is more progressive. Um, and I think their brand in a Democratic primary
Mhm.
anywhere in this next cycle is going to be particularly toxic.
I understand that. I guess the way that I'd put it is as a general matter, I've never been one for litmus tests. This is a very specific thing on the no corporate PAC, money pledge because the profit motive there is something that uniquely, I think
Mm.
needs to be like that's a very deep and central thing to how all of our politics operate across a range of issues. And so that I see as in a league of its own. But beyond that, I've never really been one to think about litmus tests or pledges. I think that it's detracts. Look, I have no. I am not naive to the fact that there may be people that have interest in this race, less by virtue of me than by virtue of Congressman Carson. The way I operate around everything and always will is that I have my views that are informed by my life, my lived experiences, but also what I'm hearing, from, my constituents to be. And I will take whatever position on any given issue, on any given policy area that I take. And if people like it and want to support, then they're welcome to. If they don't like it and don't want to support and want to support somebody else, then they're welcome to do that as well. Because at the end of the day, I'm not kowtowing towards anybody. I'm not bending the knee towards anybody. I'm just doing what I think is right as a general matter and what I think is right for my district.
Let's do a little hypothetical here. Pretend that you are successful in this primary next year and you go on to win the general. What is your first priority in Congress?
One of the things that I want to do to be a little bit innovative, and I'm trying to think of how to say it without going too deep in the weeds. Um, but look, we talked about the need to bring more federal funds home, right? That's a priority, certainly, and especially because that's something that can be done that is separate and apart from thinking about legislation, which is obviously going to be very much dependent upon the makeup of Congress, the presidency, etc. And so, from a bringing federal funds home standpoint, I would like to have staff that is specifically like a grant kind of oriented
Mm, hmm.
piece. And I want it to be collaborative because the way that I think about it, let's use the Inflation Reduction Act as an example, had 135 funding programs. The infrastructure bill had 368 funding programs. You know, which are the ones in which the city of Indianapolis would be eligible? Which are the ones in which businesses of a certain type, would be eligible? Which are the ones in which nonprofits or universities or whatever it may be would be eligible? So the first thing is we need to get more at bats. And part of getting more at bats is making sure that people are aware of the opportunities that are out there. So being able to
Yeah.
track all of this to then bring it to whatever entity that might consider applying. That's step one. Step two is most applications, when they're actually submitted, don't even meet the baseline requirements of what's being requested. So that's why having a grant writing and management team that is experienced at this, that has been on that agency side, that knows all the ins and outs of how to go about this, is extremely important to make sure that the bets that we get are actually good ones. Then there's making sure that we're, again, back to the connector, convener, kind of collaborator
Hmm.
standpoint,
Hmm.
bringing all the different assets that we have into this in the city and in the district to the table so that we're putting forward a very rich and textured kind of aspect. What most people, when they're going for federal grants, do is they think that reaching out to their member of Congress is sufficient. And what the member of Congress often does, if they do anything, is to auto pen, their signature to a letter of support. That letter of support goes to the Legislative Affairs Office. It may be addressed to the secretary or somebody at the White House, but it
Yeah.
goes to a staffer within a specific office. So the way I think about each and every grant is there are two buckets: the agency that actually disperses the funds, and then the White House. The White House will tell you that, hey, the agency disperses the funds. We have nothing to do with that, which is technically true, but it doesn't mean that they still can't
Yeah.
affect
Yeah.
things, right?
Not the current White House. Yeah.
Exactly, right.
They're
But
intimately involved in all that. Yeah.
exactly, but then on top of that, it doesn't hurt to have any application programs well socialized within as many different places as possible. So that's the two buckets. Then I think about the functional kind of areas. One, policy team. Two, intergovernmental affairs affairs team, which is state and local elected outreach. Three,
Yeah.
legislative
Yeah.
affairs team, which is the baseline that people always think about. And then four, or four or five rather, four, public engagement, which is external outreach to anybody that is not an elected official, whether it be nonprofits, universities, labor unions, businesses, etc. So if I'm the member of Congress, I'm not just doing the baseline, putting my signature on a letter and sending it to that one
Somebody
team,
else's
that
problem
one
now.
agency,
Yeah.
right? I'm quarterbacking things. I'm thinking, all right, let's get the mayor of Indy. Let's get whatever council, state rep, state senator that represents the district of where this project would land, governor, whatever. Let's put them in front of the intergovernmental affairs team, at this agency and have that. All right, from the policy perspective, who is the best position, to talk towards all the nitty gritty? Oh, this one is from somebody in the Department of Public Works, right? Just a staffer that or the director, right? That person's going to know all the ins and outs. So let's get them in front of the policy team. All right, this labor union would benefit from the project. This corporation, is in that area and would benefit. These nonprofits would benefit from it. Let's get their leadership in front of the public engagement side, and then being able to track, all right, this is the 3-day window that the secretary will have already received the memo of recommended and highly recommended applicants from the career appointees who did the line by line analysis and put forth a smaller list. That smaller list then got reviewed by political appointee leadership to that secretary across those various functions that I named. And then the secretary is then making final decisions. So if we know it's happening during a small window here, that's a high impact, high value time for the congressman to pick up the phone, and make that ask, right? And so
Yeah.
that's like, again, in the weeds, but a very concrete example of how we can be much more intentional and deliberate and methodical about how we attack this job. So that is something that not a lot of members of Congress do, and have staffs that really shepherd that process from soup to nuts. But that's something that I would want to do. And then on top of that,
Another thing. Yeah.
I want to be able to, like I said, there's a lot of power and influence that's not being wielded, right? Being able to be in a position as a member to raise funds. How do we use those funds to support party building here? How do we make sure that we have the right leaders in the right places that are both empowered, but also have the expertise and the skill sets and the ability to do the necessary work because they're the ones that are doing the day to day, right? I can support that. I can help lead that, but they're the ones doing the day to day at the end of the day. So we need everybody in the right positions at the right time.
Yeah. What I was going to ask. So, assuming you make it to Congress, you're going to wind up there square in the middle of a Trump administration.
Mhm.
The other day, Michigan Rep. Sri Thanadar was drawing up articles of impeachment, was going to introduce them and demand a vote on the floor. A lot of his Democratic colleagues got pissed off about that and said, Shri, buddy, what are you doing? Cut it out. Who was right there?
Well, Sri Thanadar is a very particular member of Congress that has often uh, operated kind of on his own. So I think there is uh, less of an issue about the action than who it came from, quite frankly,
Mhm.
because we've seen more and more members of Congress that have talked about it. And so I think that there is more support there. I think what we're seeing is that there is, from a leadership standpoint, um, uh, hesitancy on whether now is the time to do such a thing.
Mm.
And I think that kind of goes towards how we've seen leadership approach this moment in time to begin with, right? So I completely understand Leader Jeffries and Leader Schumer in terms of what their strategy is. I just think that it's wrong. They are thinking, let Trump move fast and hard, break everything. And this is a
Yeah.
touch the stove moment for a lot of people. And then we'll win, in 2026. They're not
Yeah.
wrong, but the issue is, or I mean, they're wrong in the approach. They're not wrong in the outcome.
Right, right. Yes.
Problem is that
He will
Yeah.
definitely ruin things and show people that he was a bad decision, yeah.
The problem is that I'm not worried about winning the House. We're already gonna win the House. There's a natural pendulum swing. The Republicans
Mhm.
barely have a majority. You know, folks talking about, hey, we have a chance with the senator lying, and they're making donors, they're making Democrats, pissed off because these donors are smart enough to know that we don't have a shot. Democrats that maybe don't know that are getting excited over things that aren't winnable. And so they're lying when they say that we can take the Senate back. We're not taking the Senate back this decade. We're already going to get the House. So I'm not worried about winning the House. Having a majority is sufficient, but not necessary. We need better Democrats in office. And that's why I'm running for this seat. And look, if the Democratic base, your median Democratic voter, was closer to where leadership was, then that strategy may work. But the thing is, the median Democratic voter is pissed as hell, and they should be.
Yep.
They have every right to be. And so when you're, as a member of Congress, talking about things like the courts, look, I get it. That's correct. That's right. You
Right.
know,
But it's
but
abstract to
yeah,
people's
it's
lives.
abstract when
Yeah.
you're talking about, process things that can be done, which again, I'm all about. Senator Brian Schatz talking about blanket holds to State Department nominees. Awesome. Senator Blumenthal, same thing for the VA. Awesome. But when we first talk about procedural things, or when we first talk about the courts, we are speaking as if those institutions are where the theory of change is. I believe that the theory of change
Right.
is always with the people. And so we have symbolic power, is the reality. We don't have actual power. But who has actual power? The Republicans. So how do we take advantage of the energy on the ground from Democrats, but also from independents and Republicans that maybe are feeling the heat right now? How do we tap into that? You see Rich McCormick, congressman, out of Fulton County, Georgia, in a safe Republican seat, went back home, angry town hall, or at a town hall full of angry people, comes back to DC and
Yep.
says, let's slow our roll on Doge. Troy Balderson, a Republican plus 18 district, safe seat in Ohio, same thing, right? Whether they actually have, the wherewithal, to actually do anything, that's different. But we have
Yeah.
to make
Yeah.
these people feel the heat, and we do that by meeting people where they're at. So when you mentioned folks like AOC and Bernie, and then Tim Walz and, others that are traveling across the country going, holding town halls in these Republican districts, that matters. You saw Nampa, Idaho, tens of thousands of people.
Yeah.
That's incredible, right? When you see folks like Pete Buttigieg going into, the Manosphere podcast, right? And meeting people
Smart.
places,
Very
like
smart.
that matters. Like we can't just be like burying our head in the sand. We can't just be complaining. We have to be doing something. And so, I don't care left, center, progressive, moderate, those that are doing something right now are the leaders that are standing out. And that's what we need more.
Yeah. With Thanadar, he might be a quirky character, but I think he's got the right idea that people want to see Democrats
Absolutely.
take the fight to Republicans. I mean, Trump has been violating the Constitution every day of this term, and if
It's
if
not,
you don't
every day is a
if you
constant.
don't impeach for the first violation of the Constitution, he's just going to keep doing it and doing it and doing it
Mhm.
and doing it.
Yeah. I mean, it's historical record more than anything else.
Absolutely, yeah. Last thing I wanted to ask you, since we're coming up on time here, you said the the chaos of Trump 2 that we're in right now,
Mhm.
um, is causing and will continue to cause a lot of people hardship. It will hurt people. It will kill people.
There's no bottom.
But there is an opportunity, you said, to reimagine things, maybe structural changes going forward. What is a major structural reform that needs to happen in our government to maybe prevent this sort of thing from happening again and to maybe get us to that next place?
I mean, not that it's necessarily going to happen immediately, right? But we think about a lot of things like, ranked choice voting would be important.
Yeah.
That's something that,
Yeah.
changes kind of the tenor of the sorts of people that we elect, right? We talk
Yes.
about some of these, other foundational, things like, getting money out of politics in the way that we see it. That's incredibly important. You know, I'm even thinking about things that maybe aren't structural in preventing this in the past, but Republicans, you know, Republicans showed via this just how. Sorry, it's raining here, and so the light keeps going out. There's a storm, but uh, Republicans have shown just how fragile all of this is. This is a social contract at the end of the day that we abided by, and they're just tossing it out the window. And so we don't always have to color within the lines and think inside the box. We need to think outside the box. And so, okay, there
Yeah,
we
hey, yeah, no, I'll let you sew up this thing, and
Yep,
we can
yep,
get
yep,
you
yep,
out of here before the
yep.
power goes out, man.
I know, geez, sorry.
Um,
I apologize. And then
you were talking about,
and
yeah, fair economy that works for all and,
oh,
whatnot.
that was
Just
the
cut
last
off lost you. Yeah.
Yeah, so I've got, the winning. I've got everything from a policy perspective. I've got everything from why this race matters. I also have a section called, the climb, which is, as we build this community, because that's something that we think of this as less of a campaign and more as a community that's being co-created with all the supporters that are coming into it. And so when we think about what our North Star is, what our compass is, it's courage, it's leadership, it's integrity, it's movement, and it's belief. And so it's something that guides us every day in the work that we do and how we operate with each other and how we operate with everybody externally. And so, look, we're building something new here, and we want you to be a part of it. And so, if you see yourself in this vision or anything that I said, and you're just wanting to learn more or yearning for something new, then reach out. I'm accessible. My email is just george@georgehornedo.com. My number is 317-354-7073. You can go and go to georgetown.com/volunteer if you're interested in getting involved, and looking forward to building something, for the future, and hopefully getting us back to a place where Democrats in Indiana can compete again. So no, I really appreciate you all for taking the time to listen, and to you, Scott, for, giving me the platform and opportunity to engage with your audience a little bit.
Absolutely. Appreciate you being here. George Hornedo, thank you so much for joining the Who's Left podcast.
Thank you.
Once again, that was George Hornedo, Democrat for the U.S. House of Representatives in Indiana's 7th Congressional District. I'll have follow-up thoughts for you in this week's essay. Look for that on Friday. Also, last weekend, we launched a live Sunday morning talk show featuring a panel of guests from around the state. I love the deep dives on a single topic that I get to do on this podcast, but I also want to talk more about current events in Indiana with a diverse group of Hoosiers. The network Sunday shows out of Indianapolis are okay, but half the time is wasted on bad faith MAGA talking points with pushback from a very narrow section of the Democratic establishment. Who's Left this week brings together panelists from the Democratic Socialist left to principled never-Trump conservatives. By removing the bad faith reactionary arguments of the far right, my hope is that we can demonstrate the full range of what is possible in our state once we come to our senses and toss these bums from office. Again, that airs every Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. Eastern, streaming live on the Project Next Media Network, YouTube, Facebook Live, and Twitch. Again, links are in the show notes. I hope to see you there in the comments, but feel free to reach out before then. I'm on Facebook, Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok at Who's Left, and on most other social media sites at ScottRodge78. You can also email me at scott@whosleft.us. Thanks again to our guest, George Hornedo. You can find out more about the candidate, donate, and sign up to volunteer at georgehornedo.com. You can also donate to this project at whosleft.us, where you'll find every episode and article we've ever published. Hit me up on social media with your feedback, tips, ideas, and concerns. Please forward the show to a friend and have them pass it on. Let's keep building this project and a truly democratic state, one conversation at a time. Until the next one, this has been the Who's Left podcast. I'm Scott Aaron Rogers. Love each other, Indiana.